after Spanish Crown supporters ended the first attempt in 1812 of a sovereign republic in Venezuelan territory. And with that, one of the longest and most violent wars in the history of America began. A Venezuelan with little experience and all the odds against him, he set himself the unlikely goal of reconquering Venezuela for the cause of independence. In this way, from Colombian territory, the liberator Simón Bolívar entered Venezuela commanding a small army, vastly outnumbered by the royalist troops. After occupying the first towns with the enemy, lying in wait, Bolívar declared the famous decree of war to the death, in which all Canarians and Spaniards who did not act in favor of the independence of America were condemned to death. This is a rare military proclamation with few historical precedents. Few episodes have been as controversial and have caused such harsh criticism of Simón Bolívar. But what led Bolívar to make this decision? Was it a furious action by a bloodthirsty man, or were there different important reasons that made it necessary to issue this decree? Today we are going to try to answer these questions about this episode of the independence process, which has had such an impact on the American continent. This is Ronaldo Carrillo speaking, and this is the New Encyclopedia. Although the forces that would give life to the American nations came from Spain, there were many reasons that pushed a growing number of Americans to decide to formalize their independence from the Kingdom of Spain, to assume the sovereign direction of their territories and therefore to defend this cause with a war that seemed to be inevitable. The political and economic collapse of the Spanish metropolis, which led the monarchs to intensify all kinds of restrictions, unwanted reforms, and monopolies in the American territories. The gradual development among those born in the provinces of America of their own identity, a distinctive nationality, separate from that distant and aging Spain. The historical exclusion of the American-born Criollos from the main positions of power in their own lands. All these factors, and others as well, coincided with the serious political crisis of the Spanish Empire, when the Spanish kings handed over the Spanish crown to the Frenchman Napoleon Bonaparte in 1808. In the face of this power vacuum, the long-standing desires for independence and sovereignty that had been developing for decades in the New World erupted. Venezuela declared its complete independence from Spain in 1811 and formed a federal republic. But in a short time, the royalist forces loyal to the Spanish crown managed to neutralize the disorganized Republican troops and regain control of the country. In addition, they showed their complete determination to put an end to any independence project on the American continent. Bolívar manages to exile himself from Venezuela to Curaçao and eventually arrives in Cartagena, where the independence declared by the Neo-Granadans had not yet been defeated. In this region, he focused on amassing troops to reclaim Venezuela for his cause. After achieving several victories against the royalists in Colombian territory, he obtains authorization from the Neo-Granadan authorities to enter Venezuelan territory. In this way, he begins the Admirable campaign, which would earn the Liberator his first continental glory. Bolívar and his army take Mérida and then Trujillo, where Bolívar decides to promulgate the June 15, 1813, the historic decree of war to the death, which in its introduction says, Venezuelans. An army of brothers sent by the Sovereign Congress of New Granada has come to liberate you. We have been sent to destroy the Spaniards, to protect the Americans, and to restore the republican governments that form the Confederation of Venezuela. After stating his intentions to accuse the Spaniards of having committed all kinds of plundering and terrible crimes on Venezuelan soil, and after appealing to the need for justice, he ends the decree by saying, Spaniards and Canarians count on death, even if you are indifferent. If you do not act actively in favor of the freedom of America, Americans count on life, even if you are guilty. This decree has been considered by Venezuelan thinkers and foreign thinkers as the cause of thousands of deaths, like a primitive cry of extermination that had never been heard from anyone's mouth before. The historian Juan Vicente González asserts that the war to the death, far from being a means of victory, was an insurmountable obstacle to achieving it. José Gil Fortul condemns it by saying that the Venezuelan patriots allowed themselves to be infected by the vandalistic passion of the Spanish military. Was it a mental derailment, a consequence of the defeat of the First Republic? And in contrast, for historians like Rafael Maria Baralt, this was, quote, the greatest and most significant of Bolívar's revolutionary ideas. So, well, a resolution like this, so forceful, so violent, at the dawn of building a homeland for the Americans, where did it come from? Was it the cause of thousands of deaths, or rather a necessary response to a situation that already existed? The first thing we need to keep in mind is that Spanish criminal law, which had been in force in Venezuela up until that moment. It was anything but gentle and lenient. Over a decade ago, the Venezuelan José María España conspired for independence and was sentenced to death. The royal audience of Caracas ordered that he be taken out of prison dragged by a beast, and that once hanged, the executioner should proceed to behead him and quarter his body. The head would be placed at the entrance of the city, and each of the pieces of the body at 4 places at the entrance to Caracas. According to Spanish law, the death penalty was established for treason against the crown. And what about once in 1810? The government junta of Venezuela was declared by Spain as insurgent, that is, as rebels against the king's government. The conclusion was that everyone involved with the independence revolution was sentenced to death. This was the seed of a situation that later Bolívar would seek to equalize for both sides with his famous decree. Although this is something we will address later, and I invite you to stay until the end of this video so you can have a complete picture of this very controversial episode. Another event that should be mentioned as a precedent, because it shows that the war to the death was not an idea that only came from Bolívar's mind. It was when the Venezuelan Republican Antonio Nicolás Briceño, along with other patriot officers, after the First Republic fell, he proclaimed the so-called Cartagena Agreement, or planned to liberate Venezuela. This was an agreement that called for the death of every European Spaniard who was in Venezuela. This agreement was proposed to Bolívar for his endorsement. This was in January of 1813, 5 months before Bolívar's decree. He initially rejected the plan when it was first presented to him. He rejected Antonio Briceño's plan because he believed it would create greater harm. And then, in March, a couple of months later, he agreed to it, but only partially, with several modifications, establishing that the death penalty would only apply to Spaniards found with weapons in hand, and that the Congress of New Granada would decide the fate of those innocent people who were captured. After the fall of the First Republic of Venezuela, the independence fighters faced the difficult question of how to achieve victory for their cause. And in this discussion, there was some influence from the victorious Haitian Revolution, which had declared a war to the death against the French. Antonio Briceño believed this warfare model was crucial to the Haitian victory and even before Venezuela's independence. One of the leaders of the Haitian Revolution actually suggested to Francisco de Miranda that he apply this model in Venezuela, but Miranda flatly refused. So, getting back to the main point, what made Bolívar and thousands of Venezuelans change their minds and embrace the war to the death? These events are perhaps the strongest arguments that led to making this violent decision. Well, historiographical documentation leaves no doubt that it was the Royalists who supported the Kingdom of Spain. Since they began their offensive against the First Republic of Venezuela, they started a de facto war to the death against the patriot population. This contrasted with the initially docile and conciliatory policy of the independence fighters, who, to give just one example, when they defeated the first Royalist uprising in Valencia, decided to pardon all the Royalist prisoners. All right, Bolívar said, a first precedent of this de facto war to the death was set by the supporters of Spain when, after independence was proclaimed in these lands. Outside of Venezuela, massacres were carried out in Quito, La Paz, Popayan, and Mexico, including the beheading and sacrifice of prisoners. And returning to Venezuela months after independence was declared, the Spanish frigate captain Domingo de Monteverde began his campaign against the independence fighters from Coro with more than 200 men. And in Carora, one of the first towns taken by the Spaniard, the patriotic population was put to the sword and the place was handed over to looting. Following this, Monteverde sent the Spanish captain, Eusebio Antoñanzas, to the plains to raise troops. By stirring up the basest passions and the worst resentments of the inhabitants, Antoñanzas took Calabozo and then San Juan de los Moros, and in both towns the population was killed and the towns were handed over to looting. According to historian Rafael Maria Baralt, not even women or children could find mercy. Did Captain Antoñanzas take pleasure in committing the crime with his own hands? He was the first to set fire to the houses and to spear the unfortunate people fleeing from the flames. Baralt says that this was where the unbroken series of atrocities began, which later stained the war between the two parties. And indeed, this practice became the norm and was only the beginning of the atrocities that were yet to come. Faced with these, Bolívar, convinced of the justice of the cause of independence and the need for its triumph, was forced to respond in the future with his decree. Once Monteverde prevailed over the Patriot forces, the Republican government agreed to a surrender with the Spaniard, and Monteverde became the supreme ruler of Venezuela. The terms of the armistice had not been made public, and Monteverde immediately began to openly violate them with a bloodthirsty and despotic attitude. This is reported by delegates of the Spanish crown itself, who state that during Monteverde's government, the most insulting tyranny prevailed. Both patriots' and non-patriots' property was confiscated. Arbitrary arrests were made daily. His agents, spread throughout the country, were ordered to pursue, arrest, or kill any suspect. Theft and impunity became regular practices of government agencies. Monteverde himself reported to the Spanish Minister of War, abro comillas, that the enemy has suffered a horrific death toll, cierro comillas. This began to sow resentment and the desire for revenge in the hearts of Americans, which later fueled the war of extermination between both sides. And Simón Bolívar, would he eventually start receiving information about all these outrages? Bolívar, in fact, had been impressed by the boldness, the firmness, and the leadership skills of Monteverde, which contrasted with the weak and hesitant attitude of the Patriots. We need to keep in mind that the Spanish refused to treat the Patriots as belligerents, as adversaries in a war, and instead treated them as traitors to the crown, as insubordinates who deserved the harshest punishments. Monteverde was convinced, as he himself said, and so did the Minister of War, that these people should not be protected by the Spanish Constitution, but should be treated under the law of conquest, that is, by force. And it's very important to point out that the Kingdom of Spain, which never wanted to accept mediation or negotiation with the Americans, largely approved of this behavior by Monteverde, as demonstrated by the Royal Order of January 11, 1813, which authorized Monteverde to put all the insurgents to the sword and to act at his own discretion according to the circumstances. The facts showed that the American patriot could expect no forgetfulness or forgiveness from his enemies. In this context, almost all the royalist military leaders, with thousands of Venezuelans loyal to the crown among their ranks, it's very important to mention, indiscriminately sacrificed women, men, and children. Just as in the mountains they killed those who surrendered, whether they were patriots or simply innocent people whose belongings they wanted to steal. And the testimony for all this was not given by Americans in favor of independence, but by several delegates of the Spanish crown itself, such as Pedro Urquinaona and the Spanish general Don Pablo Murillo, who would admit to all these cruelties several years later. Another royalist who at that time was serving as interim regent of the court in Venezuela testifies that royalist soldiers were encouraged not to leave anyone alive in the patriot towns from the age of 7 and up. The lowest passions of the Hispanic people contained for centuries in Venezuela had been unleashed. This was the very fierce and very complex situation that Simón Bolívar had to face, as he gradually learned about all these atrocities. During his journey through Colombia and as he entered Venezuela, a very harsh scenario, one that could not be answered with songs of peace and reconciliation if the victory of the patriot cause was to be achieved. As Tomás Polanco Alcántara states, what Bolívar did with the decree of war to the death was to seek a legal and political argument to equalize the situation. According to Spanish law, a captured Republican soldier could be accused of being an insurgent and executed, as was indeed happening on a massive scale. On the other hand, if a royalist was captured, his execution was considered murder. On one side was the Spanish state with its legal system, while on the other side there was nothing, a republic that in fact did not yet exist and lacked criminal legislation. If treason was acting against the king, and if the republic had replaced the king, acting against the republic, it would also be classified as the same crime of treason against the homeland and punished by law with the same penalty. Bolívar didn't invent anything new, he just applied the same rule that was being enforced by the opposing side. What was considered fair was that the danger should be the same for both sides because otherwise, among other things, the Republicans would feel intimidated and the Royalists would feel empowered. As the historian Augusto Mijares argues, the war to the death would be the only way to force the Royalists to give up the de facto war to the death that they had started. Bolívar attempted this upon returning to Caracas after his Admirable campaign, or as he actually achieved later in 1820, with the Treaty of War Regularization agreed between Gran Colombia and the Kingdom of Spain, which formally put an end to the bloody war to the death. The writer Rufino Blanco Fombona says, I quote, "Can it be stated without fear of making a mistake before men of science and analysis, that the war to the death proclamation was nothing but the voice of many consciences, the cry, the attitude of everyone's soul," end quote. Now then, for the historian Indalecio Liavano, there was a more important reason behind the decree. Another highly relevant factor enabled the massacre of Republicans by the Spaniards. It's that the strategy of the Spanish military leaders included the promotion of a terrible race and class struggle among Venezuelans. The peninsular Spaniards allied themselves with the less privileged strata of the country against the upper Creole classes, who were the promoters of independence. Creoles in Venezuela had maintained a rigid caste division system, unlike other Spanish provinces. In this context of race war, Bolívar takes on the vital task of fostering American consciousness, a widespread feeling of their own nationality as a spiritual affirmation in the face of Spain. A consciousness that had been forming for a long time but was limited to a small Creole minority. Bolívar believed that a deep, powerful, and even violent incentive was necessary to mark that difference between the peoples of America and those of the Spanish metropolis. According to Libano, this was the primary reason that led Bolívar to declare the decree of war to the death. Initially, it was merely a response to the Spaniards' brutality, because if it were simply a retaliation, it wouldn't explain why the Americans who were in the royalist ranks were pardoned, when in fact they made up the majority of the army. As the decree states, I quote, "Count on absolute immunity for your honor, life, and property. The mere title of American will be your guarantee and safeguard. This amnesty extends even to the very traitors who have most recently committed acts of treason." End quote. This desire to establish a privilege for the Americans, even if they were enemies, and a total condemnation against the Spaniards, even if they were indifferent, showed that their purpose was to create a definitive border between Spain and America. To the race and caste struggle unleashed by the Spanish captains, Bolívar tried to respond with a war of nations. He tried to unify Americans against Spaniards. And with that, he also intended to stop the royalist troops from growing with natives from the American continent. In response to the harsh criticism this decree has received, the historian Jesus Antonio Cova argues that those who condemn this historic measure by Bolívar are not actually bothered by the war to the death itself. Because it's true that all kinds of great massacres in human history, in contexts of war and conquest, still find all sorts of justifications today. For Cova, what bothers people about the decree is its sublime eloquence and its ability to penetrate people's consciences. Or as Rafael Baralt would say, having done openly and frankly what others prefer to do in the dark. And despite the terrible violence that surrounds the decree, from the future one can see its results. The existence of a homeland that did not exist before, the Constitution of the American Republics, and the achievement of sovereignty to govern their own destinies. According to Rafael Baralt, the words of the decree could not express its necessity more concisely or forcefully. Those words were the kind with which a strong man of great spirit and deep passions dominates and captivates lesser souls. And despite themselves, he leads them to carry out the vast purposes that only he is capable of conceiving and pursuing. And another important point worth keeping in mind, as Augusto Maharis points out, is that the war to the death decree was very rarely applied to the letter by the Patriots, and that Bolívar on several occasions openly showed his intention to suspend that decree. Upon entering Caracas triumphantly after the remarkable campaign, Bolívar proposed several conditions to Monteverde for general reconciliation. Am I opening quotation marks with forgetfulness of the past and pardon for the Spaniards? However, no agreement was reached due to Monteverde's total refusal. Another example is the Ocumare Proclamation, dated July 6, 1816, when Bolívar clearly states, "The war to the death that our enemies have waged against us will cease. For our part, we will forgive those who surrender, even if they are Spaniards. No Spaniard will suffer death outside the battlefield." End quote. However, it would be a few years before those words became reality. One can debate the appropriateness of the war to the death decree as a wartime measure. One can even debate the underlying cause, that is, the cause of the independence of the Americas. But it is neither true nor honest to describe the decree as a rash, emotional decision driven by a bloodthirsty desire on the part of Simón Bolívar. Nor can it be denied that the circumstances in which it was proclaimed were profoundly harsh and complex. In the face of the cruelty unleashed by the Spanish, the race war, and all the adversities against them, the Republican Army gained the necessary momentum to reach Caracas victorious, restore the Republic in Venezuela, and undertake the long process of emancipation. At the same time, this decree was a key event in the expansion of a movement with national and continental consciousness. What would earn Bolívar the title of Liberator of America? If you made it to the end, thank you very much for watching this video all the way through. I invite you to leave your comments, your recommendations, your questions, as well as to share this channel, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. See you in the next episode.